Hey, this is Caitlin from Magnolia Heirlooms, and I want to show you how I did the machine binding on this quilt. So I'm going to start with the fabric for my quilt binding, and your quilt pattern will tell you exactly how much that you need to bind your quilt. And I'm going to be using the Stripology XL ruler today to cut my strips. This ruler has slots on the different measurements so that you can use your rotary cutter to cut the dimensions that you need. So it's really easy to cut strips, and I am cutting 3.5 inch strips for this quilt binding. You can do 2.5 inches, you can do 4 inches. It's kind of up to you, and you can kind of play with the different measurements and see which one works best for you. Okay, now I've got all of my strips cut. And the next thing I'm going to do is just trim off all the selvages because I don't want those selvage ends in my binding. So I just cut them all off with my rotary. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is join the ends of the strips together. You can do this using a straight stitch like I'm going to do, or you can do a bias stitch. So you can add them together at a 45-degree angle. But I'm just going to do a straight stitch, 1/4 inch seam allowance here. And I'm going to keep going until all of my strips are sewn together in one big line. Now the next thing we need to do is iron the strips in half. So I'm going to start at one end, and I'm going to fold my strip in half and just iron that down. And I like to use lots of steam so I get a real crisp line. When you get to the area where the strips are joined, I like to just press that seam open and then continue pressing it in half. So we're going to do this all along the length of the binding until we have our whole binding strip ironed in half. Okay, so I like to do this before I start sewing anything on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my quilt and put the binding strip along the edge of the quilt. One, to make sure I have enough binding to go all the way around with plenty to spare at the end. And I'm also going to make sure that one of those seams where we joined our strips together doesn't end up right at the corner. It's okay if it's close to the corner, but I don't want it right in the middle of the corner, because that adds a little bit of bulk where I don't need it when I'm making those nice mitered corners. So that should be fine since it's not very close to the corner, and we should be good to go. I am going to use a seam guide to help me get a really nice even seam. That's a magnetic seam guide, and I'll link everything that I'm using in the comments below, so you can see exactly what products that we used. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure to leave a good tail and not start at the very end of the strip, to leave that good tail. And then we're going to put the raw edges together. So the raw edge of the quilt and the raw edge of the binding are going to be on the same side, and the folded edge towards the center of your quilt. And we're going to stitch along the edge. And I am using a 5/8 seam allowance on here. You can use a 1/4 inch if you'd like. Kind of play with that as well, the seam allowances, to see which one you prefer. So this gives me kind of a medium-sized binding. I don't like mine too tiny, but not too big as well. As we approach the corner of the quilt, what we're going to do is sew right up until 5/8 of an inch away from the edge. So whatever your seam allowance is, you're going to leave that much room between where you stop and the edge of the quilt. And then make sure your needle is down, and we're going to pick up our presser foot, pivot, and sew to the very corner of the quilt. So we're sewing like a little angle to the corner, and you can go ahead and cut your thread at that point and take it out. So now we're going to pull up that binding strip and make it even with the edge. That's going to be a nice 45-degree angle, and then fold it back down so that it lines up with the very edge of the quilt at the fold. And you'll see how that makes a really nice mitered corner once we get it all finished. And then just resume sewing that same seam allowance, 5/8 of an inch, or whatever you choose, down the other side of the quilt. Keep going until you get all the sides sewn. I wish it went that fast. And now I'll show you again the corner. So you're going to sew until 5/8 of an inch away from the edge. And then we're going to pivot, sew to the corner, cut our thread. Now you're going to pull that binding strip up and make that 45-degree angle, and then fold it back down so that it's at a 90, and continue sewing. So I am sewing this first step of the binding on the front of my quilt, and I like to do that because when you sew it on the front and you flip it to the back, you've got a really nice even edge there, and I like that on the front of my quilt. A lot of people like to do this step on the back of their quilt so that then when they pull it to the front, you won't have a seam line showing on the front of your quilt. And I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a minute. But it's really your preference. If you want to sew it to the back, flip it to the front and make sure it stays nice and even and you don't get that seam line, then that is perfectly fine. It's really just preference. I'm just kind of showing you techniques here, and then you can adapt as necessary. Okay, so when we get to this point, don't sew all the way. You need to leave probably 8 to 10 inches that is not sewn down, and you'll have your two tails. Okay, here's how we are going to join our tails together. So you've got a lot of excess binding. So what I like to do is cut a little bit off of the end of one of the tails, and you're going to use this little piece as a template. This shows you the width of your binding, shows you how much you need to overlap your two tails. So what I'm going to do is lay them both out, and that's going to show us where we need to cut these. Make sure when you're cutting that you cut on the correct side. Don't cut back to the left there, because your binding will be too short. So make sure you're cutting from the loose end on one side and then pull the other, and make sure you don't cut the strip underneath it. So you're going to see where that one ends. Line up your template. And like I said, don't cut the strip underneath it. I didn't cut that very straight, so I'm going to go back and straighten that up. Okay. So that is how much that we needed to overlap. You can use a ruler as well and measure, 3.5 inches, which is the width of our binding strip, or you can just use that as a quick template. Okay, once you get your tails trimmed to size, what we're going to do is put them right sides together at a 45-degree angle, so the ends of your tails are kind of form an A. And I'm going to pin this to help keep it together while I sew. And also you can pin this excess of the quilt or clip it to kind of keep it together so it doesn't want to separate the ends of your tail. Okay, so we're going to put pins in that. And what we're going to sew, so look at this and think of it as a man. So you've got the two legs or your two tails. And what we are going to do is we are going to sew the waist from here to here and not the crotch from head to crotch. So waist, that's what we're going to sew. It's a silly way to think of it, but it actually helps. So we're going to put it under the sewing machine and we're going to sew from corner to corner at an angle. And when you remove your pins, don't cut anything yet. Go ahead and remove your pins. And when you pull the two legs taut, it should line up correctly. So see, you've got a nice miter joint there. And once you're sure everything is correct, it's not too late at this point. If you mess up and sew the wrong direction, you can pull it out and redo it. But once you're sure it's correct, go ahead and trim that to about a 1/4 inch seam. And then we're just gonna finger press this open. I mean, you can use an iron if you'd like, but I just finger press it real quick. We're gonna fold that back over and it should lay really nicely along the edge of your quilt with not extra fabric in there. Now what we're gonna do is sew that part down. So I'm gonna put back my seam guide, make sure I have the same seam allowance as before, and sew that down. And now we're going to do a happy dance because we're halfway done. Now we're going to take it over to the iron and iron that seam open. That's going to help a lot when it comes to flipping it over to the other side. I think this is an important step. And I like to make sure to use a lot of steam and get it nice and flat. Now that we have everything ironed and ready to go, we're ready to sew our binding on to the other side. So what we're going to do is flip this over and sew that down. So a few tricks to help with this. First, I'm using a top thread that's going to match my background. So since there's white and this maroon, I'm just going to do the maroon color, and then the bobbin I want to match the border of my quilt. So it's gonna be stitching on the top a little bit right next to here. So I'm fine with seeing that seam, but I kind of want it to blend in. So I'm gonna use a thread that closely matches. To help sew the binding on, we're gonna be using this bi-level foot. If you don't have this, you can do it with a regular foot and I'll show you how, but this just helps a little bit to keep accurate when we're sewing, and I'll show you in just a second. So this is the bottom of the foot and you can see it has this raised section right there. So I will show you once I get it on the machine kind of how that's going to help us out. Okay, we've got the bi-level foot on our machine and I've got my quilt flipped over to the back. So you can see this seam where we stitched the binding on the front side. So we're going to pull the binding over and we want it to go just past the seam. So if we sew directly on the seam or maybe a little bit to the right, you're going to see your seam on the front like on top of your binding, and I don't want that. I want it either right close to the edge or even a little bit on the border. So let's get rid of that little string right there. So what we're going to do is pull this over and we want it to stitch on the very edge. So how the bi-level foot can help us, so the raised part is on this edge here. So when we put our fabric underneath, we're going to line it up I'm going to zoom in here. You can actually see there's a little mark right here. So we want to line the edge of our binding up with that mark. And that raised part is going to help stay on the edge right here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my needle over as far as it'll go. And now it should stitch on the very edge of that binding. And I'll cut that to show you. You won't cut right here, you'll keep going, but I just want to show you what it did. So there, it's stitched on the very edge, and then on this side, there's just barely a stitch line right there that you can see. Okay, I will show you again. Now we're just going to keep sewing right along that edge until we are to the corner. I like to check it along the way and make sure I'm staying right on the edge and that I haven't sewn up onto the binding on the other side. So that's helpful to do periodically. When you get to the corner, you're going to kind of pull up the other side and make a nice 45-degree angle there. You'll kind of have to hold it with your fingers, or you can pin it as you sew. Make sure your needle is to the down position when you stop, so that if you need to lift your presser foot and put it back down to kind of make sure that fabric doesn't get bunched up. And if you stitch a little too far, you can back stitch a stitch or two to get back to where you need to be. And then you're just going to pivot and continue sewing down the side. And it makes a nice corner on the other side as well. And here's our finished binding. You can see the seam line that blends in with the background fabric there. And like I said, if you wanted to do this to the reverse and have that seam line on the back, you can definitely do that as well. So here's our finished quilt. It's all bound and ready to go, and this is a lot faster than hand binding. Thank you so much for joining us on this video, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for all our latest videos. See you next time.